Hey folks, it's Claire from Impactful People. Thank you for joining us for another one of our podcasts. Today I've got Sam Stilwell with us. So Sam, would you like to do us a quick intro?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Samantha. I am a cultural anthropologist, and I specialize in cultural diversity in the workplaces. So I use all of my anthropological theory and my time in HR to help people in HR and who are also leading teams understand the diversity on their teams and how to manage them more effectively.
Super. Well, I always like to start with the absolute basics on this show. So explain to us what anthropology is, what it means to you.
In a nutshell, like the highest level definition is anthropology is the study of cultures. Um, Cultural anthropology is like a meta version of that. So you're really looking at how the culture, like different communities and how people interacting together can form culture or can deteriorate culture. There's other branches of it. There's linguistic anthropology. So you're looking at culture specifically through language and what language can tell us about a community. But yeah, anthropology is really studying people essentially, but very much from their behaviors and their patterns perspective, as opposed to like the neurology or the cognitive side of things.
Yeah. So super relevant to when leaders are thinking about building their teams, especially if we're global, but it doesn't even have to be about, different locations in the world. There's so many different cultures, even within our own countries and locations. So yeah, very interesting. So I'd love to know a little bit more. What some of the things that you see as key challenges within businesses when you're looking and supporting them with their cultural diversity?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is that people don't recognize what are the actual nuances or what are the actual pain points of cultural diversity. I think we all have a general understanding of those big, like the glaring problems, like, maybe we speak different languages than one another, or if we don't understand somebody's accent, right? So there's a lot of those types of things. But I see a lot of people, whether it's in the HR space or the leadership space, mislabeling a lot of things as either a performance issue, an engagement issue, poor communication, whatever the case may be, when in reality, it's actually related to cultural differences. And so, somebody could be that you label as a poor engagement could actually be highly engaged, but just in their cultural context. And so you're misinterpreting those cues.
That's so interesting. I'm sure everyone will have examples of when things like that have happened either to them or to people in their teams and businesses. I guess there's a big part there around stereotypes as well, and then how we expect people to be behaving in certain situations and how someone engaged should be presenting themselves. So how can leaders and businesses think about that differently?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I encourage people to do is have a dialogue around it. Like, I think to your point, we really, and I mean, as all human beings, we love to generalize and we love to just apply one giant approach to a group of people. And the issue is, or kind of my opinion around handling cultural diversity, managing teams effectively, is that we have to get comfortable living in the nuance. We can't just label people. We can't say that every person who comes from India is going to have the same general experience and need. This is just simply not the case, right? And similarly, you can have somebody who is immigrated here or who has, is third culture. And so they've lived in a couple of different places. And so the best way to approach cultural diversity effectively is to engage in that dialogue to say, what is it that you need? How are you expressing things? What feels different to you? And this can be, this feels like a heavy lift, and I get that. And that's a lot of things that I hear back from leaders is to say, we're already so busy, like having these kind of conversations is just going to slow us down. And so that's where I've worked with, there's a bunch of research that's out there and tools that exist in order to make these conversations incredibly effective, incredibly fast. But it has to start from a point of dialogue as opposed to like a position of, I assume what's going on, or I assume to understand what's happening.
No, I can totally imagine that actually. So I guess one of the things we should touch on is why should businesses care about this? What are the impacts to the businesses and the people that in their teams if they don't focus on these areas and don't invest the time?
Yeah. Yeah. The biggest impact, and this is research I came across a couple of months ago, which it didn't surprise me in the sense that I was like, yeah, okay, I kind of had a feeling, but it was shocking that there was research already that existed on this, which was great. But it's on a day-to-day basis, if you are forcing assimilation in your workplace, which is essentially you are expecting anybody you're bringing in to act in the way that your culture acts or the way that your workplace culture acts, it means that they're not being authentic. And I think in DE&I, we talk about authenticity a lot, but we don't then match it to what that means, like why that's a problem, right? I think a lot of business owners, kind of as why you're asking this question is like, okay, but we can still get stuff done if people are inauthentic. Like that feels like a nice to have. The issue is when you start digging into the cognitive side of things. And when we start to understand that our brains are constantly trying to maintain membership in any given community, because community is the key to our survival, and survival is our ultimate goal as human beings. Right. And so when we're in a workplace, that workplace becomes one of our communities that is key to our survival. So we're asking ourselves, okay, what do I need to do to fit in? Usually, if we're in a place that is very similar to our cultural context, that answer comes very easily and we have a general understanding. Or, when I'm hanging out with my family, I have a pretty good sense of what I need to do. Yeah. So my subconscious brain, my unconscious brain isn't actually spending much time trying to figure that out. When you're in a workplace and you're expected to now mirror the culture that's in front of you, because there isn't room or there isn't space to show up authentically as who you are. The research is showing that you spend as an individual upwards of 60% of your mental energy trying to reflect this dominant culture back to the person who has it.
Wow.
And so my question to leaders is always, if you could take 60% of somebody's energy and redirect it back into the vision of your company, what is that worth to you? So suddenly, we're able to put that number to authenticity to say, it's not some fluffy word to say people feel better. It's literally that our brains are expending copious amounts of energy trying to fit in, and they'll never stop expending that energy because it is important for our survival in order to fit in.
Yeah.
So if you don't give them the context they need in order to feel that fit or understand how they work, they're going to be searching for it unconsciously. We're not even aware that it's happening, but that's what leads to burnout. That leads to, we're missing deadlines, why we're not able to hit our objectives as a business. So it all comes back to, for me, and based on that research, it does come back to that question of authenticity or showing up within your own proper culture and having space to be able to do that.
That's blown my mind a bit. Like 60% is a huge amount of your brain capacity, right? That you could be using on so many other things. And like you say, subconsciously doing it. Wow. Yeah. What kind of reactions do you get from leaders when you share that research with them?
I think people are, definitely shocked. And they kind of sit there and they're like, oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. I hadn't thought about that, especially because 60% is a big number, right? Yeah. So it's not even something that you could maybe put to the side and say, like 10% of their productivity, like we can deal with that. It's like assuming 60% loss of energy, right? If you were to say tomorrow you would lose 60% of your revenue, that's not ever a reality that any business owner is willing to take. I think the next question then is, okay, we see how important it is, but we don't, like, where do we even start? This feels like such an insurmountable topic and we don't even know like where to begin. And so I think that's where it can sometimes overwhelm people if it's not brought in with the right tools, because it's, it's the equivalent of giving somebody a piece of feedback about, I don't know, like how they're dressed. And you're like, you know what, the way that you dress doesn't really look professional. And that's great. And you've been able to demonstrate to them why it's important to dress that way, but then you haven't actually shown them what steps they can start to take. So now the person's just like uncomfortable and they're like, well, I know that you think this and I know that it's important to change this, but I don't know where to begin. So for me, it's being able to couple that research with resources right off the bat. And that way it's nicely packaged. So the overwhelm is maybe a couple of seconds as opposed to, a couple of weeks of just spinning tires and freaking out.
So I guess I have another question that I imagine leaders ask as well, which is, how do people measure this? How do they know if they've got a problem in this area and people are spending 60% of their brain worrying about this stuff versus actually they've been on a journey and people are actually, being much more effective and efficient and feeling included and in a safe space?
Yeah. I've got an answer that's uncomfortable to hear, and I've got maybe a little bit more of a constructive answer, so I'll share both. You can edit out whatever you want. Okay. Yeah. So the uncomfortable one is at the base, unless you're having these types of conversations in your organization, you can almost with 100% certainty guarantee that these issues are happening in your workplace. And it's because, right, in schools from a very young age, people are not taught how to show up authentically. People are taught how to assimilate and how to mirror whatever they're seeing. Yeah. We see this a lot, right, in minority groups where they're talking about code switching. So from a very young age, people are taught how to change the way that they speak, the words that they use, right? And so this for me is what I get a lot of pushback from teams who feel like they're doing a lot for DE&I in their workplace. And the answer that I get to my question about, like, how are things going is, oh, no, like everybody's really cohesive. We don't actually have any issues. Everybody gets along and works well together. And the concern that I have with this kind of answer is that it tells me that, okay, well, you probably just have a lot of people in your organization who are masking. And we don't realize it, especially somebody like, I look at myself, right? I'm a white, straight woman who grew up in a middle-class family. For me, it is so difficult to understand that somebody could actually be putting that much effort into showing up as somebody else. And so we don't even think about masking. We don't think about code switching. We don't think about any of those things. So for my short, uncomfortable answer is, it is happening in your workplace, even if you do have DE&I initiatives, because you're not asking those right questions to actually go to employees and say, what do you need? And in order to ask them what they need, you kind of need to give them some options.
Yeah.
And because we're not taught that in school, in HR certifications and leaderships and MBAs, we don't even know what options to give them. So this is where like these tools have been really helpful, is to come in and say, you can launch this dialogue, but you know, here are some dimensions that you can go into, very much like psychometric testing, or I compared a lot to love languages. I think I mentioned this to you before. It's like, you know, if I'm trying to explain to my partner how to show me love, but I've never seen these love languages before, I'm explaining a very nuanced feeling. But the second my partner comes to me with a list of love languages, I can go and say, oh, okay, let me prioritize these really quickly. So, you know, that's how I know that in the workplace, this is just an issue that is all over, is because I'm not seeing these resources and these conversation tools in my network. I'm not seeing them in, you know, the trainings and stuff.
Yeah. There is a great tool in the UK actually that I'll send you after this, called Fair HQ, that I'll also tag in the bottom of this, but I'd love to get your thoughts on the work that they do, because I think it's very, very interesting, and trying to support businesses in the UK with this type of work too. So I think we should dig into now some of the things that people can do. So, you know, we understand there's the problem, there's a challenge. We also know, you know, this isn't a new problem. It's something that's been around since the beginning of time. We probably feel it more since the move to real remote working has been happening. And that's in some ways creates some more divisions between even people within the same country, never mind people more broadly. But we've got these really diverse workforces. And I guess the other element for me is the big rise of your company culture and people talking more about culture and their values and the behaviors. Hopefully they're talking about the behaviors that sit under their values. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this, which is, I appreciate, a massive topic, but what should businesses be thinking when they're talking about their company culture, and how should they approach this in a way that is inclusive?
Yeah. The first step is to define company culture. You don't have to have a definition that matches everybody else's. Like, my definition of what company culture is might be vastly different from somebody else's, but it's to actually sit down and say, for our company, what does this word mean to us? Because I think everything stems from there. It kind of all trickles down. And so if there's no clarity on what company culture even means, then any of the initiatives that you're trying to do to impact it aren't clear either. So when we're talking about equity in the workplace, we need to understand that people are coming from different contexts and they're coming with different understandings. And so we can't assume that they have that same access to information, that they have the same access to discussions or dialogue or anything that we do. And so for me, that conversation around equity in the workplace and workplace culture starts with just give a clear definition. The kindest, the most generous, and the most equitable thing you can do is to be explicit in what your company is doing, because then it gives people the autonomy to actually make decisions for themselves, right?
Yeah, I know we bonded over this before, because I bang on so much about kindness and being a kind leader. And I think it's not about giving everybody everything or trying to please everyone. The kindest thing you can do is set out clarity and let people opt in or out of if it's right for them or not. So yeah, 100% aligned on that one, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that's a really good point, actually. I think often we think that when we talk about company culture, that the difference might be in what your company culture is rather than what your definition is of it. And often it's like this really basic stuff that can make the big difference, isn't it? Just go right back to the beginning. And when we're talking about company culture, what do we actually mean in the context of our business? So yeah, I love that as a simple and easily actionable starting point.
Yeah. And I think it's because even when we're talking about, we'll say, for example, things to help define company culture, like, oh, we have an open door policy. And we assume that saying something like that demonstrates to everybody what our relationship with hierarchy, for example, would be in the organization. Except for the fact that when a lot of people hear open door policy, it still doesn't tell them, okay, but what am I allowed to say to the people when I walk through that door? How often am I allowed to walk through that door? When I do, what are the consequences if the discussion doesn't go effectively, right? So it takes a lot more drilling down than we realize. And so I think that's where also it gets to me sometimes is people will try to add in these ways to express it, but it's like, but that's still very abstract. It's not concrete enough. So how can you make it even more?
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard you talk before about low context workplaces. I'd love you to share kind of your thinking on that as well, because I think that ties in very nicely here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this kind of ties back into your other question as well about what are actionable things that companies can start doing. I always tell them that in a culturally diverse workplace, which is all of them at this point, right, because of high levels of immigration, globalization, remote hiring. So we can safely assume that every organization to some extent is diverse. And the number one dimension that we need to nail down very, very quickly is the high context versus low context communication. And then this is my opinion on things after researching it and everything, is that every organization needs to be low context. What this means is, so high context, it's a spectrum. So high context sits on one side and low context is on the other. When you're a high context culture, it means that you assume there's a high shared context between you. So I compare this a lot to a family member. If I'm talking to my sister or my childhood best friend, my partner, any of these types of people, it's usually a very high context conversation. I can make one remark or say like one sentence, and it will remind my sisters of the camping trip we did back when I was 5 years old. Yeah. And she knows the emotions that were involved in it. She knows the heartache, the problems, the things I celebrated, the stuff, all of that in one sentence. Whereas if you were to overhear that conversation, you would not have any of that information.
Yeah.
Right. So there are entire cultures that operate this way. I get a lot of cultures like Japan, China, India are all very high context. Brazil is another more high context on that spectrum. And so these are all countries where when people are communicating, their communication is very nuanced and it is very abstract naturally because they have that shared culture and they understand one another and they don't need to be explicit. You take North America, on the other hand, and North America is incredibly low context, which means that we assume there's a very low amount of shared context. Part of the reason that this happens is because you look at how North America was built, and we are built on the back of immigrants, right? And so we know that we don't know one another because none of us have a shared context. So we're incredibly explicit in our communication. When I say that organizations need to be low context, I'm by no means saying that they need to model the North American way of doing things. That is very, very problematic, and I don't encourage anybody to do that necessarily. But it's like, well, I want to be very clear about that. But what I do mean is that there's a lot less that can be misinterpreted when you're communicating very explicitly. So for example, if you have somebody from Japan speaking to somebody from Brazil and they're both very high context, there's so much that can be misconstrued because they're not being explicit and they're coming from their own context and they're applying that context to whatever they're hearing. And then that's going to help them understand whatever is being said in a certain way. So if you're able to be more low context as a business, it means that you are being explicit. It means that you're defining certain words, right? Like, what does culture mean? What does engagement look like for us? What is our relationship with hierarchy? Like nothing that is happening in your organization should go without saying, essentially, if you're a low context organization.
I love this. And I find it such an interesting human dynamic where I've sat in so many meetings, like I'm sure millions of people have, where everyone's nodding along going, yeah, get that. And you have a conversation with people afterwards and you're like, that's not what I took from that meeting. And I'm not sure what that person took from it. And my technique has always been to get people to draw, because I'm a very visual person, draw what they think the meaning or the outcome or the process, whatever it was that we were talking about. And suddenly everyone's like, oh, no, that's not what happens. That's not what I was thinking. You're like, oh, okay, right. So do you have any other tips or tricks of ways people can, I mean, I know you've talked about those definitions, but there are other things that you recommend people do that can help kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's to your point, right? It's at the end of a meeting, just being able to get people to vote on a decision, for example, right? So to have these trigger moments that make sure that anybody who doesn't feel 100% certain about what they understood is actually going to raise their hand to say, hey, I need to clarify, because if my vote is going to count in this, or it's being written down that I said something, I want to make sure that I really understand the implications. I think in the workplace, we spend a lot of time just fudging it and saying, oh, you know what, like I'm pretty sure I understood what was going on. But when you ask somebody point blank to actually make a decision then and there, it then triggers this response to say, okay, wait, I have a couple of follow-up questions. The other thing that happens, and it's funny because I'm not entirely certain how a remote world is going to, or a virtual world is going to deal with this, But a lot of ways that these things got clarified is after the meetings, like the water cooler talk, when you're walking around in the office, you'd hear somebody talk about the meeting, and then you tune into it and you're like, oh, hang on, that's what you, I mean, exactly like you said, right? Like that's what you got? Because that's definitely not the conversation I got. So that's a big question mark that I have in how we're going to deal with that virtually, because we don't have those exchanges. But I think, then it goes back to, again, maybe you assign somebody at the end of the meeting to be that person who does the overview, to say, okay, to clarify, this is what we decided, this is why we decided it, this is how everybody feels. And then if you're being explicit in that way, people who don't align with that or say, oh, that's not actually the message that I got, it allows you to have a follow-up conversation or to take it offline and to do like a smaller group or something like that. So again, like things like we do it very naturally in Canada and the US. I'm not sure what the UK or Australia are like. I know they're a little bit more low context, but follow-up after meetings, like I know we're obsessed with that.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the business. I think there's some places where it's really good practice. I think, like a lot of other countries, we tend to make a lot of assumptions a lot of the time. And I think it's more, I'd probably say we're on the lower side as a like generalization, but I think we do make lots of assumptions in classic human, we're busy mentality. I think I've said this to you before, like most of the businesses I work with or people I work with, it's the simplest foundational stuff that they need in place. Because sometimes we get so caught up in this, the world's complex, the problem's complex. And actually the best thing you can do is go back and simplify it. Go back and say, if I was starting this from scratch, what are the things I would want in place? Do those things exist today? If not, then that's where we start building from. And often it is about realigning people on your purpose, your vision, your direction, why you're doing something, what something means in that context. A lot of the kind of things that you're talking about here as well. So yeah, lots of crossovers, I think.
Yeah, no, I love it.
So I'm just going back to some of our notes that we took when we were talking. You've talked before about different forms of cultural integration, and I'd love to dig into that a bit more with you as well. And the four that exist, the one you think's the best. So tell us more.
So this concept around these four integrations is usually used when we're talking about immigration. But I use it a lot in the workplace as well, because in theory, if you're moving from one workplace to another, there is some form of migration that is happening from one culture to a next. But essentially, it's the experience that somebody who's immigrating to a new culture is going to experience. So there's one where essentially it's assimilation. So assimilation is where you reject your native culture and you completely take on the host culture where you're coming. There's another one which is a little bit more liminal. It's isolation. And this is where you reject your native culture because you feel like it's getting in the way of you being able to integrate. But you also reject the host culture because you feel like it's also getting in the way of you being able to integrate, and it's forcing you to get rid of your native culture. So you don't accept either of them. The third one is where you actually reject the host culture and you keep your native culture. We see this a lot in smaller diasporas that are existing right across the world. And so it's small communities where people will move. When they move from another place, they know that community that exists. And so they'll move into there. And so they can still speak their languages, have their festivals, like do all these kinds of things. But, the outside community sees it as, well, they're not trying to integrate. The inside community says, well, you're not even giving us a chance to integrate. So forget that. We're not giving you, our time. And then that final one is true integration, which is where you're actually able to keep the host culture and keep your native culture and find ways that they work really well together. So this is the one that, when I talk with organizations about cultural integration and they talk about there is a lot of cohesion, one of those questions that comes up is what is the cohesion being caused by? Is it being caused by them completely rejecting their native culture and taking on your culture? Is the cohesion just by the fact that they're entirely passive and they've chosen to reject both cultures? So they're just showing up and doing their job and they're saying, you know what, whatever, none of this matters. I'm going to be a professional and then I'm going to go back to, doing my life in isolation. Or is it because you've actually given them space to show up as themselves and then to also learn about, the benefits of the host culture and say, okay, how does this actually play into the way that I'm used to doing things and the way that I prefer to do things based on my own cultural context? So those are always things I encourage organizations to look at. Is cohesion we tend to see as a very positive thing. But if you're getting cohesion at the cost of somebody's energy, somebody's mental health, somebody's ability to connect to their roots, right? Like I say to this to people, you and I have talked about this, but for me, my number one purpose in life is to do everything I can to protect cultural diversity. And the second that you get somebody coming into a workplace and rejecting their native culture, you are at a greater risk of actually losing a culture altogether. And I've had so many conversations with people who have immigrated here. I've had friends who are first generation Canadian, or American, or from wherever, and they have this experience of saying, yeah, I don't even know the language of my parents, or the language when I go back to that town or that village that my parents are from. I can't communicate with people locally, or they consider me to actually be an outsider because I don't have those connections, because my parents wanted me to give me the highest chance of success in this new country. And for me, I find it incredibly unfortunate that you have to actually totally cut off ties with all of your history and everything that informs who you are and why you are in this world, in order to then feel like you're part of something in this new country or this new workplace that you're going to. So I'm pretty intense about those things, to say, cohesion is less important to me, because I would rather people be showing up as themselves, and then we can start to make things work together. But it can sometimes be a big red flag for me if companies aren't having this dialogue and they're saying, actually, things feel incredibly cohesive in our workplace.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. I feel like I could ask you so much about this area that might go a little bit off topic, but I find it really interesting. So I'm Welsh. I was born in Wales. I don't speak Welsh, other than the two slightly offensive words my brother taught me when I was younger. But it's quite a big thing in Wales as well. Like, the language has died out in the vast majority of South Wales. And I was lucky enough to play hockey for Wales, and in our team we had 2 players that spoke Welsh. But we found it really hard when they spoke Welsh to each other, because nobody else in the pitch had a clue what they were saying. So it was almost like they could only speak Welsh to each other if it wasn't something that impacted the rest of the team, which is like, how do you define that? I don't know. It's really interesting. And even I remember we used to play against Belgium quite a lot, because they're obviously relatively close to us. And in Belgium, they speak multiple different languages. And on the pitch, they would have French speakers, Flemish speakers, some Dutch speakers, and then they would end up speaking English a lot of time because it was the common language. But it's just the dynamic and the impact that has on your team about whether or not you force them down a certain path is just really interesting, I think. And it can be complex, like we said right at the start. But the other thing I was just thinking about is where you were talking about those first 4 types of integration. Is, I'm sure there's something interesting, and you might do this when you're working with businesses as well already, in how you actually measure where they are on that scale of 4 types of integration, and then how you kind of help them move towards something that is more effective for them as a business. Just thinking back to kind of the measuring and maybe the dialogue and some kind of assessment or questionnaires you could be doing with your employees.
Yeah, I love that so much. It's already, now it's got my wheels turning as you're saying that, to kind of be like, what are questions that I could be, are little things to, like, I have considered seriously rebranding myself from the startup anthropologist, was kind of that original persona when I started my business, and then my online persona, to like the Sherlock Holmes of culture, because it really is being able to like look, it's like those tiny things, right? Like it's like whenever you watch those murder mysteries and everybody's like spouting their thing about like, I didn't do it because blah, blah, but then they're like, because I was with so-and-so, and you're like, hang on. But like, have you ever watched Legally Blonde? I don't know if this is going to be a reference that everybody gets.
I have. Of course I have.
Okay. So, when she's like listening to the testimony from the person who's being accused,
I know exactly.
And they're like, well, no, I didn't do this because, I was getting my hair. Yeah, right. And like my hair was getting permed, and then I had to take my shower. And she was like, yeah, exactly. And she was like, nobody showers, right? Like, we would know that. But it's like that little detail that otherwise most people would have missed. And so for me, it's really that in culture. It's being able to say, like, when you're listening to people talk, the way that they give answers, everything, sometimes it's incredibly subtle. But then you pick that one thing, and it's a string, and the more you pull, everything just unravels. So I think that's the other thing, is there is no one size fits all for approaching this in a workplace. It just takes being able to develop that keen eye, which everybody can develop, I'm convinced, but to kind of nitpick and say, hang on, that thing that I heard that isn't sitting right with me, let me pull on that string. Why is that not sitting right?
Also, I just so love you use that example, because I did a post on LinkedIn about that exact scene a while ago. Then I had a little, I'm not sure that Legally Blonde itself is the best description of diversity as a whole, but that scene I thought was very good example. But it also,
It's so good.
I'm guessing you've read Rebel Ideas by Matthew Seard, which is just very much talks to this point. Like, that is the importance of diversity in the workplace, is, you know, the different experiences we have, the meaning that different things mean to each of us, and how we're going to interpret things. Like, without that diversity of thought and experience and cultures, you're going to have a very straight line in terms of how you do things and how you think about things, and what a massive missed opportunity for businesses. I'm sure the vast majority of customer bases do not fit that single
Yeah, absolutely.
feels
No, it
obvious.
is. It's so important. So
I feel like we could go on all day. There's so many things around this that I'd love to dig into, but I guess to kind of keep it quite practical for people, and I'm thinking about this, obviously we've talked a lot about businesses, but are there any tips? I mean, I know dialogue is a big one, but any tips or advice you would give to leaders and managers when they're thinking about how they're working with their own teams directly, how they could, like, even just small things they could start doing on this journey to kind of build more of an inclusive environment?
yeah, absolutely. The number one thing that I encourage, and it's sometimes less glamorous, or maybe it's a little bit more triggering because it's a harder task, is to just understand who you are as a person. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out the people around us, and it's very difficult to do that if we don't have a point of reference. And so I'm always encouraging leaders when they're like, you know what, I'm having trouble getting through to my team and everything. I'm like, well, let's work on you then first.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know truly who you are, your team can't even begin to figure out who you are and what you might need. So that feels like a lost cause. And then you also can't figure out who they are, because you're just, I mean, you end up spinning your tires at a certain point saying like, well, in relation to me, what does that feel like? Right. And it's kind of like, to go back to those love languages, it's like, if you don't even know how you receive love, you can't even begin to understand how somebody else would.
Yeah.
So for me, yeah, it's being able to go back, and I'm happy to, I have this PDF that goes through these core cultural dimensions that I can share with you, and you can add them into the show notes if that would be helpful. And
Fantastic.
I just encourage people to go and look over them and to say, okay, on each of these spectrums, where do I think I sit? Like, draw a line between them, put your dot, figure out what that is. That dot could change over time as we have, you know, we evolve as human beings, we have different experiences, we move to other parts of the world, we take on new cultures. So I would say keep checking back. That's the other thing, right? Is to be able to say, this is not gospel truth. What it is this year could be very different in 2 years from now, or even 6 months from now, depending on, you know, what's happening in your life. So yeah, I would say take a step back first, take a second to say, okay, where do I sit on all of these? And then that next step is to actually go into your workplace and have that conversation at your next one-on-one to say, hey, I did some digging onto myself, learn these things about me. What resonates with you guys? Where would you put yourselves on this spectrum? And so that launches then into that dialogue we talked about. But yeah, the number one action is that. The other thing, if you're not ready to do that internal work, and I understand that sometimes it can feel very overwhelming, and we don't all have the mental capacity to dig into who we are, feels like a very loaded question, or can bring up, you know, old memories of, again, masking all these things. We don't know what you've been taught from a young age to kind of put behind, and now you start looking into it and you're like, oh, and then you have to talk to your parents and grandparents, and it gets really convoluted. So if you're not in a position to be able to do that, and I totally understand that, then I would say just start, again, being more explicit in your communication. That high-low context is incredibly important. So when you're going into a meeting, just experiment with, you know, the next time you use an acronym. This is a very simple one. Next time you use an acronym, just do what we do in research, which is to put it in brackets, right? And say, this is actually what it means. The amount of times on Google Meets I've heard somebody spit out an acronym, and I go into the chat and I just write for everybody what I think it means. And then sometimes I've been corrected. Other times people are like, oh yeah, thanks, Sam. I thought we all knew that. And so yeah, I would say, like, experiment with your acronyms, try to describe those. Or when you're using a word that feels very common, sometimes just pausing and asking everybody in the group and being like, so I'm using this word. What does it mean to everybody, by the way? Here's my definition. But where are you all getting? That allows you to start getting a read without entering into a big dialogue. It could be a fun icebreaker situation to say, okay, I'm going to pick one out of the 100 of words that I'm going to use at this, you know, team stand-up presentation or whatever. What does this one word mean to everybody? Gets people excited. And then for the rest of the presentation, people start to ask themselves, okay, do I have varying definitions of other words? And it might encourage them to raise their hand. The reason this happens is because, again, subconsciously, our mind is constantly filtering information on our conscious mind's behalf to save energy. And so there's a lot of stuff that we don't actually hear. I feel like the percentage I've seen varies, but it's definitely greater than 50%. I want to say as far as 70% of the information that our brain, so our eyes and our ears receive, we are not aware of consciously.
Mm.
So our unconscious mind filters the majority of that with our cultural context and all of these things, which means that we are literally blind and deaf to a lot of what is happening in every single conversation that we're having. When you change that and you ask your mind to start looking for the surprises in what's being heard, then all of a sudden your brain can't filter it because it's saying, oh, I need to anticipate that this is not going to match my filter. And so suddenly you actually end up hearing and seeing significantly more than you would have previously. So something as simple as this icebreaker to say, what does this word mean? Then tells everybody else's brain in the meeting, oh, does that mean that other words don't have the same meaning? Oh, now I need to start looking for things that don't match my filter. And then you're actually active listening. And for me, that's an easy trigger to get people to active listen.
I love that. I think that's just really simple, but like you said, just gets people thinking a bit differently. And I think the acronyms is such a massive one. Like, I cannot tell you how much they do my head in. Like, what is the most alienating thing when you join a new business is everyone's speaking acronyms and you're not feeling okay to ask. And I think even like you said, just some of those activities can also show that it sets a tone, doesn't it? That actually we want you to ask us if you're not sure. We're not going to make an assumption that you know everything, or that these things all make sense to you. I used to, in one of my previous companies, have like an acronyms document that was like, anytime you hear someone use an acronym, go and put it in there, and it can die a death, or at least it's somewhere that people can go look it up if they need to, or they're not necessarily comfortable asking in the meeting. But yeah, they can die a death as far as I'm concerned. Down with the acronyms.
I love that. Yeah, no, it's such an important tool. Like, I've even found myself not wanting to ask because I'm like, oh, that's silly. And then my logic is I'll just go on Google afterwards and find out what it means. And then I don't know if this has ever happened to you where you go on Google and you type in an acronym and there's like 16 different possibilities. And you're like, well, none of these actually fit with the context of the meeting. So now I'm out to lunch and I have no idea. And to your point, I like the tool of this dictionary. Again, not every culture, especially if that hierarchy relationship is different. So again, Japanese culture, very, very, very structured relationship with hierarchy. You're not going to raise your hand in a meeting to ask your senior what anything means. And so it's a missed opportunity if you as a manager don't even think to ask people. You assume because there's no hands raised, there's no question. Even if you ask, does anybody have any questions? They'd never ask a question. This is a trap. I'm not going to raise my hand. Like, absolutely, you can forget about it. So to give them this tool in the background to say, instead of, again, assimilation is expecting them to learn how to start raising their hand in a meeting. Whereas pure integration is saying, we have another tool. So if you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, you can still get the information that you require to know what's going on. So I love that you're doing that. I think it's great.
Super. Well, I mean, I'm conscious we're coming up to the end of time, really. But I think if we can touch on it briefly, one of the other areas that I think is really, really important, and you and I have talked about before, is going back to culture as a whole. You can have your company culture, but you can also have a variation of that within your team. So I'd love us to talk a bit about what those anchors are. Where do companies need to keep consistency when they're talking about their company culture, and where should teams have the flexibility to go and, create what's right for that environment and the people that are part of that team?
Yeah. I think the biggest anchor for me is, you have your vision, so everybody's working towards the same thing. That's nice. That, again, is something where I would say break that down into keywords and make sure that everybody knows exactly what this means. I've given examples at conferences before where, like, your mission maybe, or your vision is to, increase the excellence of customer service. And what does excellence look like? What does customer service? And this is always the joke I make. And I feel like I can make it, having, my partner who's from France, is that customer service in Canada and customer service in France are vastly different things. So if you have a French team and you're a Canadian business and you say, we want to increase the excellence of customer service, the things that you are both working towards will be very, very different. So already the alignment is gone. So I would say, like break that down into what do these things mean to us. But the other thing is values. And I tend to go like do away 100% with values. And I've heard you use the word that I like to use as well before, which is behaviors, or what are the things that are going to help us make the decisions, right? So I think when we hear values, oftentimes in North American context, at the very least, we equate that to our ethics and our morals, because that's usually they're both used in the same context.
Yeah.
And company values are not that. And this is my kind of blanket statement to everyone is like, if the ethics of the company do not align with yours, you do not belong in that, like, please leave. But your personal values don't necessarily have to align with the company's values, and you can still have a very successful and very happy and very fulfilled career. The reason is that the company values are things that tell you that in isolation, let's say there's a total citywide blackout, or I don't know, global blackout, you have no internet, you have no way of connecting, and you have 30 seconds or 5 minutes to make a decision. Those values should help you in making a decision that you know for with about 99% certainty is going to be a similar decision that anybody else in the company would have made. And so that's where I encourage companies to take a look at, what do your values mean? Make sure that they're, again, not abstract. They need to be very concrete, and make sure you have like 4 things. Okay. And this is a checklist. Your values are the four things that when you have to make a decision, or you're bringing up a new idea, or you want to start a new project, or whatever the case may be, what are the 4 things that this new idea or this decision, whatever, has to check off?
Yeah.
And if it checks all of these 4, then go ahead with it, or bring it up, or send that email, or do what you need to do. Same for, again, email communication, whatever. Like, have those 4 things. Don't go more than that. That just gets confusing. So if you have those 4 things, then you can still have subcultures in all of your different entities, or if you have teams in different parts of the world, how they then achieve those values. So for example, if you're saying that, we want people to, I don't know, what's a good value? I've never actually listed example. I have a ton of examples of really shitty values. But yeah, like an example would be, okay, we don't want it to impact our revenue growth, let's say, for example. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that we can still make a decision culturally we can still ensure that it doesn't negatively impact the revenue growth. So for example, this could mean that we want to make it negatively impacting revenue growth means we want to make sure that we don't lose customers. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that we could do to make sure that we don't lose customers, and how we communicate and how we, any of those kinds of things. It might not be what the team in Singapore does, and what the team in the UK does, and what the team in Germany does. They might approach that from very different ways based on their own cultures, but the end goal and that outcome that we're looking for is still achieved, which is to retain customers and to make sure that our revenue growth isn't negatively impacted. So this is where I say, yeah, if you can be very, very explicit about your values, make sure that they're seen as more of a list for making decisions, or for taking action, or for communicating, as opposed to just these like nice things that talk about who we are. Then you give that autonomy and freedom to these other cultures and these other groups to still make their decisions in a very diversity of thought way, or a very innovative way. But you make sure that alignment kind of stays, that red thread is there all the way through.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Gosh, that's another podcast of its own. We'll keep that one separate. So this has been super interesting. Thank you so much, Samantha. If there's like 3 key takeaways that you would want people to leave this conversation with, what would they be?
Yeah, my number one is define culture for your workplace. Like, do everybody a favor. And my definition of workplace culture is that it is a collection of signals that lets an employee know whether or not they want to attain, so if they're joining your company or whatever, and maintain membership in your community. So essentially, I mean, the simpler version of that is your company culture's job, number one initiative, or like number one mandate, is to let employees know when it's time for them to quit. Which feels very counterintuitive to like engagement and retention initiatives. But, don't be forcing people to stay in an organization that they're not happy in, or they don't feel aligned with. So that's my definition. Figure out a definition for yourselves as a company to say, what does culture mean to us? Like, genuinely, and then dig, like, ask me like 5 more questions to really get that nice sentence, to make sure that it's incredibly concrete. So that's my first thing to do. The second thing is asking ourselves how our DE&I initiatives that we're putting into the workplace. And if you don't have any, honestly, that's a good thing in my perspective, because now you don't have to start from scratch. You can kind of say, okay, we're just starting off, so now we get to incorporate all of these things. But if you already have these initiatives in place, taking a step back, and I know it sounds like an easy ask, it's a very difficult ask, but taking that step back and that humility to say, how am I applying my own cultural context to DE&I initiatives in the workplace? Yeah. I think as DE&I professionals, people tend to assume that, because this is what I personally need from a DE&I perspective, they tend to assume that maybe that's what other people need as well. And so being able to take a step back and say, I did not coin this term, it comes from an Austrian anthropologist, but your culture glasses, being able to take your personal culture glasses off and put them to the side and be a bit more objective to say, okay, what am I actually hearing? That's where that active listening comes in, to be able to say, I don't want confirmation bias to come in. I'm genuinely going into this company to say, what are the real issues? Not the trending issues, not the things that my colleagues or my peers are talking about. What do I see as the real issues? They might not be sexy. They might not be these flashy, fun things to work on. They might be something that's simply handled by one conversation and that will be very, very thankless as an initiative and nobody will ever know that you did it. But that for me is truly working in the DE&I space. And it's hard for us to do because we tend to think we spend so much time researching and trying to understand. It's hard for us to understand that we still have a lot of patterns of thinking that get in the way of actually the effectiveness of the programs we're trying to put in place. So that would be my second takeaway. My third takeaway is the one that we talked about earlier, which is figure out who you are. And figure out who you want to be. Like what is important to you is who you show up, right? Because sometimes those two can be different. But figure out who you are and who you want to be. And then once you get to that who you want to be, just ask yourself that extra question of, why do I want to be this person? Is it because I feel like I can't be the actual version of myself? Is it because I've been raised that it's inappropriate to be this way? Is it because my friends or my peers have made me feel like I'm not going to get, integrated in this community if I am? Or is it because I genuinely feel like this is authentic to me and this is, what I want to do? So figuring out those two things will save your friendships, will save your family relationships, your romantic relationships, and your workplace. That's the fun of the work I do, is like so often it's, like I'm talking to people and they're like, oh, this explains why my husband and I really don't get along. Or like, this explains why, and I love it so much because it's just like, it's human stuff again, which is maybe that's my bonus takeaway is, remember that you're dealing with humans. So try to take the pattern out of it and try to really be comfortable in that nuance. Try to really be comfortable in saying, in the event that I don't know anything, it's a practice that anthropologists do a lot called making the familiar strange, where we look at everything in our surroundings that we think we know a lot about and we act as if we know literally nothing about it. Like you're an alien, you just came down, you don't even know what a workplace is, and you show up, what feels weird to you? And those weird things, then you can start to investigate that. So that would be, I don't know if that was clear, but that's my bonus takeaway.
Yeah, I love that. And I also like your obvious little side gig of saving relationships everywhere, which is watch this space for Samantha's new relationship coaching. Love it. So I have two very short questions that I always ask at the end of these. One is, do you have any recommended reading or articles or books that you would always point people at on some of these topics that we've discussed?
Yes. There's two that I recommend. One is The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. Yes. And I'll send you a link so that you can include that in show notes. But yeah, this book is, you do not have to read it chronologically. You can read it whatever chapter. So I always tell people, look at the chapters, look at what's happening in an organization, read the chapter for the thing that feels the most prevalent, and then read the rest of the book. It's the tool that I use the most, that I pay for, is Erin Meyer's tool. It's based on over a decade of research. It's incredible. So the culture map is one very easy one to start understanding this topic of cultural diversity at work. And it's really fun to read. She has a lot of anecdotes that are hysterical. So I love it. The other one is called Anthrovision by Gillian Tett, I believe. I think she's a British author. And it's all about how anthropology is used in the workplace. It's incredibly biased that I, recommend this book because I just want everybody to understand why we're so valuable. But at the same time, it really helps you to understand how you can start being an anthropologist at work. It looks at not just culture from that sense. So Anthrovision is also focused on how anthropology has been used for UX design, for product design, for internal operations, for, efficiency, all these different kinds of things. But it starts to give you different questions to ask, a different worldview, different frameworks to start looking at the things that are happening in front of you so that you can make sure that you're solving the right problems. So Anthrovision is a really good one. It saves you having to do a bachelor's degree or a master's in anthropology. It's a nice way to get the Coles notes of everything that I learned.
I love that. Thank you. I will make sure we add links in the description as well. And then my last question is always, if you could hear us talk about any topic on this podcast, what would you love to hear us discuss?
Oh, this is a good, you know what? I would love to hear people unpack, and this is because I have so much to learn on these conversations, unpack vanity metrics when it comes to celebrating diversity at work. So things like, I had a conversation with somebody the other day in my network around Juneteenth and like celebrating that and what's the right way to do it. But even things like Pride, right? Like how do you celebrate that? International Women's Day. Like there's a lot of these things that I know, I hear people talking, and I see my LinkedIn is absolutely like full of people complaining about it not being done the right way. And I'm like, I would love to have it unpacked to say, what are things that people can be doing? You know, the small things, because again, I feel like for these types of conversations, it's not some big giant display. It's just like day-to-day respect and approach. So yeah, I would listen to that episode like 16 times in a row, just for my own personal learning to be like, okay, how do we talk about this differently?
Yeah, I will definitely start digging into people I could get to talk about that, because something I care a lot about as well. And also like doing it, making sure it actually is relevant to your business and what your business stands for, not just a classic tick box exercise. Go back to values and what your culture is. Like if it's not part of your culture, like don't do it because you feel like you've got to. It's just disingenuous. But anyway, that will get us on a whole nother topic if we carry on down that. Samantha, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved this. It's been a real pleasure. You've taught me a lot as well, and I hope others will find it incredibly useful.
I appreciate it so much. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for more of these chats because we could go on and on. So this is great.